I'd like to introduce you to my colleague Helen Wright, who will be helping run today's webinar. Morning, Helen.
Morning.
Very shortly, I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Andrew Sneddon from AECOM. But just before that, the purpose of this webinar program is to give you an overview of the opportunities and challenges involved in decommissioning, in particular within the nuclear and oil and gas sectors. These two sectors in the UK alone represent multi-billion-pound complex projects spanning decades. There are substantial opportunities for innovative suppliers to assist decommissioning contractors, save time and money, and solve complex technical issues. We recently delivered our flagship decommissioning event in Manchester, and to save me telling you all about it, I'd just like to show you a short film that I hope speaks for itself.
One of the things I find most encouraging about coming to TotalDECOM is that this isn't just the giants who are here, that there are many SMEs who are here as well who have extraordinary specialist skills, and they're going to have a really important role to play.
Well, TotalDECOM represents something really quite unique in the sort of the conference calendar and the event calendar, in that they are actively promoting this cross-sector participation, and that's why we've, right from the start, from the inception of TotalDECOM, we've been keen to participate and to support it.
The international market for the decommissioning sector is enormous. TotalDECOM have got an opportunity here of actually doing what they do, but in a wider context.
If we are really serious about collaboration between big businesses, small businesses, government and the public sector elsewhere, then it's events like this which actually make that happen.
I think this is really one of those areas where there is certainly more we can do now, and TotalDECOM is a great opportunity of beginning that work and bringing people together to start that practice.
So before I hand over to Andrew, if you'd like to ask questions, please use the chat module, which you should find on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Or if you're using the Click Meeting app, you'll find the chat function as one of the options on the top left of your screen. My colleague Helen will collate these questions and pose them to Andrew at the end of his presentation. Any we don't have time to cover, we'll try and get answered after the event. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to Andrew Sneddon, Director of Offshore Operations from AECOM. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Owen. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm going to talk about nuclear and offshore decommissioning and whether there's a two-way street between these two industries. I work for AECOM based in Aberdeen, and my remit is to develop AECOM's service offering in offshore decommissioning. I'm also a non-executive board member of DECOM North Sea, and that's an organisation with over 400 members. I was a project director for Halliburton and was responsible for decommissioning platform in the Dutch sector for NAM. I was the project director for Brent Spar Engineering Solution and project director for decommissioning plan for the Phillips Mooring platform. I also founded an offshore exploration company and an E&P consultancy company. This morning I'm going to talk about some market analysis between the industries, a little bit about sector comparison, the key success factors in decommissioning, and a little bit about AECOM. So with low energy prices predicted possibly for decades, and the graph on the right is the most recent projection from BASE, energy companies and governments are facing a trilemma that arises from their debt position, the cost of new production, and the cost of decommissioning liabilities. So that creates a difficult choice, either to defer decommissioning with the consequences of plant dilapidation, or decommission differently. Globally, there's significant growth in decommissioning, with dams, oil and gas facilities, nuclear power plant, defense and weapon systems all coming to the end of their useful life. If we don't decommission them, then they decommission themselves, as happened in California a couple of months ago. In the nuclear world, the EU currently estimate that by 2025, there'll be 155 closed nuclear reactors. Cost of decommissioning those reactors has not yet been estimated, and neither have the funds been allocated. In the oil and gas world, there's quite a wide range of estimates for decommissioning liability. Current UK OGA estimate stands at approximately £47 billion. Some observers consider that is far too low, and that the figure is actually closer to 100 billion. So just to pause for a moment, I'm going to give you a number of decommissioning insights as I go through this presentation. And the first one is, we're seeing a rapid global growth in decommissioning exacerbated by previous deferrals. It's competition for decommissioning expertise. I mentioned oil and gas, nuclear, dams and defense weaponry, but there are also refineries, pharmaceutical plants, shipping, petrochemicals, even renewables like wind turbines are being decommissioned. The list goes on. It's competition for resources like project management and potential for supply chain bottleneck. Turning a little bit to sector comparisons. Two principal government authorities in the UK concerned with decommissioning are the Oil and Gas Authority and Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. Both of these authorities are facing substantial decommissioning liabilities. The Oil and Gas Authority estimate or predict a $1 billion spend in 2017, doubling next year, and the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority spent 3.3 billion in 2016. Principal difference in funding between these organizations and for the decommissioning effort is that in oil and gas, only part of the decommissioning liability is paid for by the taxpayer. The industry pays between 25 and 50% depending on PRT history of the field. With nuclear decommissioning, the government funds the entire decommissioning liability minus any income generated. Despite perceptions, there are significant synergies or parallels between nuclear and oil and gas decommissioning. In both cases, there was very little given to how these facilities would be decommissioned when they were being constructed. In both cases, there is limited decommissioning experience, more so perhaps in the nuclear world than oil and gas. Plants often left to dilapidate before being removed, becoming unstable and broken and making the decommissioning effort far more difficult. Both face regulatory challenges and both have many stakeholders. In both cases, we may be faced with incomplete plans and records or indeed none. We find in both industries that there may be a need to repair or recommission before deconstruction, for example, recommissioning drilling rigs on platforms. So we think the actual synergy has a far greater overlap than perhaps the perception is. However, the world's changing. Where energy industries previously enjoyed high revenues, prices have slumped, changing the supply chain from a seller's market to overcapacity. Rather than revenue flowing into the treasury, the government and taxpayers are faced with significant decommissioning liabilities. So there's increasing scrutiny on how taxpayers' money is being spent. We've moved from a situation with high margins to low margins. We see in both industries a requirement to embrace the concept of a dynamic safety case. That replaces the more or less static safety case of production operations. The dynamic safety case has to embrace the loss of equipment and systems as key safety systems such as deluge systems, alarms, light and power are shut down and removed and replaced by temporary systems. So operating a flexible safety case requires expertise in decommissioning to make the program workable. So to my decommissioning insight number 2. We believe that oil and gas and nuclear have far more in common than has previously been recognized. Perhaps this is being recognized more now through supply chain groups. Market forces are similar, as are some of the technical, safety, commercial and regulatory regime issues. The clients, however, are significantly different. In the UK nuclear decommissioning industry, there are only 2 clients, the NDA and EDF. In oil and gas, we have more like 40 clients. So in both nuclear and oil and gas, what do we consider to be the key success factors in decommissioning? Take as an example AECOM's contribution to Sellafield. We successfully retrieved the first spent fuel from a legacy pond in a period of 50 years of operation. In 5 years of management at the site, we provided the NDA and the government with greater understanding of the challenges. We saved over £1 billion, and at the same time, we achieved the site's best ever industrial safety performance. Further key success factors are, in our mind, program integration. I'll demonstrate later in this presentation that we can save up to 30% on a major program. We also think that decommissioning mindset is vital to put the mission into decommissioning. Characterization of the plant, waste routes, and ultimately the end state to be achieved, and attenuated operations, a term we've adopted to describe the process of decommissioning while the plant is still alive. In planning, we place great store in preparing extremely detailed execution plans with realistic schedules and estimates. End state characterization, for example, defining how clean is clean, is vital before starting the operation, whilst also clearly defining waste routes. So we begin with the end in mind, focusing on risks and characterizing the plant. This is followed up with prioritized scopes of work, so the project is started in the right way rather than quickly. It's also communicated clearly and frequently. Beginning with the end in mind requires a thorough knowledge of the wastes to be generated so that waste options can be planned in advance and often waste is eliminated. In defining end state criteria, this must be agreed with stakeholders. Now, that might seem like an obvious statement, but there are some classic cases of that going badly wrong. And the removal and disposal of materials from site requires planning and phasing with ongoing operations. So I mentioned earlier the decommissioning mindset. In all decommissioning projects, there is potential for resistance, not only from the workforce, but from regulators and other stakeholders. We find with employees engaged in decommissioning, resistance from people who have worked in plant for sometimes their entire career, have nursed equipment and plant, maintained it. They see it very much as their baby, as their responsibility. And then we as decommissioners come along and we ask them to tear that down. And some employees are just not capable of changing to that mindset. It's important to have that end state mindset from day one. And I would suggest that day one starts some considerable time before the end of production. That's what we mean by attenuated operations. So we see an opportunity to start the decommissioning activity while the plant's live, while there are still employees, while there's still knowledge on site, to make the entire decommissioning program successful. What's absolutely vital is that safety takes priority over everything. Decommissioning is different to production operations. Plant is being dismantled and often is changing on a daily basis. So modifications to the workplace must be reviewed for process hazard and procedures reviewed for hazard impacts. Changes taking place in the workplace need to be matched with training to reflect changes in process and procedures. This applies equally to operational safety, with new materials being brought on site. If workers are to be given authority to stop the job, they also need to be involved in work planning. So to the third of my decommissioning insights. There are many lessons learned from 2 decades of decommissioning. It may seem obvious to state, but decommissioning is not operations. It's very different to production operations. And the mindset change is challenging but vital. Right now to talk a little bit about the company I work for, AECOM. We're a company of over 90,000 people working in 150 countries. We perform almost every kind of engineering. If it's got engineering in the name, we do it somewhere. In the UK, we have approximately 7,000 employees, globally about 500 offices, and a revenue of 17.4 billion in 2016. Our approach to decommissioning is in moving projects forward against a tight, planned schedule. What that does for us is helps to minimize unpleasant surprises. And at the same time, we understand the need to update plans and procedures as the work progresses. We see an opportunity to simplify the conventional stage gate process, and rather than having 7 or 8 processes, we would rather reduce that to a 4-stage process, continually reviewing and evaluating hazardous materials and processes to ensure that workers are not exposed to health hazards. Our approach adopts a streamlined project management process, eliminating what we see as unnecessary stages which are more appropriate to capital projects. Give a couple of practical examples of where AECOM have been successful in making savings. This slide shows the baseline spend for a 10-year project in North America, which AECOM managed, and the blue columns demonstrate the savings that AECOM were able to achieve year on year over that 10-year period, achieving a total of 31% savings. The second example was also a site in North America, owned by the US government and operated on behalf of the US government by AECOM. In that case, AECOM were able to complete the work 3 years ahead of schedule and achieved $1 billion saving for the client. So in summary, I'd like to say that we see rising costs and shifting schedules requiring a new approach. We've used innovative and incentivized contracts and integrated program management to achieve success. We see transferable skills. I see a question coming up as to what those transferable skills are, and I'm happy to answer that at the end of this presentation. Those skills include planning, contracting, and in some cases, hardware and technology. What's common to both industries is a need to remove optimism bias. Risk management needs to be a culture. As a company, we've worked in some very challenging, inhospitable places in the world. We're still learning, and we're willing to share that experience. So thank you for listening to my presentation. Now I'm happy to start to answer some of the questions that have come up.
Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. Just to kick off the questions, first question from me, Andrew. You spoke about a partnership approach through the supply chain. How do decommissioning companies, rather than operators, actually facilitate that partnership approach? How does it manifest itself? And do you think that the lower levels in the supply chain do actually have an understanding of what's needed, what the decommissioning companies themselves actually need in terms of products and services further down that supply chain?
So I think I'd answer that in two parts, Owen. The first part is one of the ways in which we've achieved that sort of partnership is to work with companies that on any other day of the week we would see as competitors. One of the phrases that my colleagues use is competimates. So we'll work with companies if we can find the best solution to form an A team. In terms of whether the supply chain understand what's required, I think that is something that certainly DECOM North Sea is working hard to improve, and there are a number of initiatives to improve supply chain understanding. I'm less able to answer the question for nuclear. I think there are a number of fora, and yours is one, Owen, in which the supply chain can engage and understand perhaps a little better what the tier one contractors need and what the clients need. But I don't think we're there yet. I think the much abused term collaboration is something that we have done in nuclear. We do collaborate, we do work with our competitors to get the best team together. But in answer to that part about the smaller companies in the supply chain, I think we've still got some way to go.
Thank you, Andrew. In your own sector, in the oil and gas sector, I speak to quite a lot of supply chain companies in the nuclear sector who are very cynical about being able to move from sector to sector. Is the offshore sector really an open supply chain for new suppliers, in your opinion? Are operators and decommissioning companies like AECOM open to companies coming from other sectors and providing their skills and services?
There is a history of transferable skills between the industries. I see Doug Harrison's question, what the technical skills are should be transferable. The history dates back to the requirement in the oil and gas industry for radiological support. So many of the radiological protection advisors and training came from the nuclear industry. So that has been going on for probably the best part of 40 years. So there's a quick answer, Owen, to that part. Yes, there are skills. I think that depends very much on what the requirement and demand for those skills is. So I think there are worker skills that are transferable. I think welding, radiological protection, pipe fitters, some of the blue collar workers. I think those skills are transferable. There's certainly transferable skills at a senior management level. David Peaty just moved into the NDA from the oil and gas industry. Previously, the MD at Sellafield was Tony Price, who successfully moved backwards and forwards between the oil and gas industry and the nuclear industry. So there is movement of personnel. I think maybe your question was more directed at how easy is it for one of the smaller supply chain companies to move into oil and gas. And I suppose the answer to that, Owen, really is it depends very much on what the demand is. If the industry needs that service, then they'll find a way of employing the service. But having said that, I do recognize that at times companies do find it difficult to find an in.
Thank you, Andrew. Just over to Helen now for the first of our chat board questions. Helen?
Well, I think Andrew's covered some of it. It was mainly from Doug, the first one. Obviously, he's from the National Skills Academy Nuclear, so has a particular interest in the skills side. What skills really does he believe that are required for companies to move from nuclear to oil and gas and back again? So technical skills, and also how I guess you would change the mindset of people who have been working in production and then maybe having to change over to doing decommissioning.
Yeah, and I think if we're really talking about decommissioning and the skill set change or transfer in decommissioning, then it's also very important to recognise that we place a lot of store in planning and scheduling, and we certainly believe that that is a skill set which is transferable. The characterization of hazardous materials is certainly something that we see as being transferable. In terms of the actual physical hands-on decommissioning effort, when that work comes onshore, it's fairly simple work. It doesn't require a large workforce. So suppose the answer is more complex in terms of looking at the work breakdown structure. Some of the components of the work breakdown structure, like project integration, program integration, is something that we very firmly believe we can transfer from nuclear into oil and gas. Some oil and gas requirements, such as heavy lift, are clearly specialist to the oil and gas industry, and there's very little transfer, there's very little opportunity to transfer because it's not something that the nuclear industry uses. One of the largest parts of oil and gas decommissioning is well plug and abandon. That accounts for something like 50% of the spend. Again, that's not really something which would be transferable out of nuclear. But when we start looking at things, some of the more specialist activities, such as radiological protection, program management, then I think those skills are very much transferable.
And I guess following on from that, Pat Stokes has asked what has been particularly successful and what maybe not so successful with supply chain engagement. So, the learning from nuclear decom, what's passed over very well. Have you got any examples of that?
I think program integration has passed on well. I think that our rigorous planning and scheduling has passed on well. There are some great examples of technology going in the other direction. So Sellafield, for example, was faced with inspection issues in some of the ponds and silos, and the offshore industry, of course, for years has been using remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and those vehicles are just ideal for remote intervention in ponds and silos.
And of course, then the questions seem to be coming very nicely in order. But again, so innovation is key as well, would you say, for keeping new ideas coming into the sector, into both sectors?
Well, I think actually we're careful about innovation. We're very careful. I think in both industries, we're careful not to. I think there's a real danger in innovation of disappearing down a rabbit hole in trying to develop new technologies. And I think what we've done in both industries is to adopt and adapt. So where possible, we've taken existing technologies, proven technologies perhaps from one industry, and the ROV technology is a classic example of that, and taking it straight into the other industry without really any requirement for any change to technology. It's been directly applicable. So I think there is a bias against innovation. Probably some of the listeners on this presentation will identify with that, and anybody that's tried to introduce new technology into either industry will recognize that often industry and particularly individual clients don't want to be first. There's a race to be second in using new technologies. So it can be difficult to break into that market, and that's why looking around and finding existing technologies is often the preferred route. We, as a company, also looked at using some of our technologies on gravity-based structures, technologies that have been used successfully in nuclear decommissioning in South Carolina.
Thanks, Andrew.
Did
Just
that
on the
answer the question?
innovation.
Pardon, Owen?
Yes, I think it did, yes. Just following on from the innovation, Michael Kavanagh has just made a statement, and I'm just going to read it out. He said perhaps some energy could be directed towards his tidal power system. Further down, he says he's got patent rights to this very simple but very large system. The government has told him to form a consortium and then go back to them to find funds. And he's obviously struggling with that new innovative technology to try and form a consortium within sectors. I'll just leave that in the air at the moment. Going back to Doug Harrison's final question, and I'll just read it out. He said, Pat's question, and was highlighted in Andrew's presentation. Collaboration between clients and supply chain has been a key success factor in nuclear. And Andrew says in his presentation there are only 2 clients in nuclear, but over 40 in oil and gas. Surely key to success would be to get the 40 oil and gas clients working closer together. Wouldn't that be wonderful for the UK government, Andrew?
Well, and actually, Doug, the Oil and Gas Authority is trying very hard to get those oil and gas clients to work together. One of their objectives is to reduce the decommissioning liability by 35%, and that's only going to happen by getting those clients to work together. So whether they're willing to or whether they're being dragged forward, there's certainly an appetite for collaboration, to use that much abused term. There's certainly an appetite within the Oil and Gas Authority to get those clients to work together. And I think that there's a growing recognition that decommissioning certainly in oil and gas is not something that client companies should feel is competitive. And there's probably far more benefit in those companies working together. There is a collaborative effort going on at the moment in the southern North Sea to try and get a campaign approach to well plug and abandon. And what a campaign approach does is reduces costs through reducing mobilization, demobilization of equipment and vessels, but it also increases efficiency. So while the first few wells may suffer from the forming of that efficiency, the latter wells to be plugged and abandoned will certainly benefit from the improved and increased efficiency as teams work together and learn how to become more effective and more efficient. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll be a bit short of time now, but we've just got one more question from Bill Roberts about the impact of deferral. There's a pressure to defer decommissioning. Is that a false economy? Why should investors put scarce funds into decommissioning now instead of later? I guess first of all, do you agree there is a pressure to defer, and what should we do about it?
I think there's absolutely a pressure to defer. I think it's very difficult for a CFO to justify the expenditure for something which has very little return. But I think what Bill is pointing at, and he's absolutely right, is that can be a false economy. I know of at least one platform in the North Sea that the decommissioning was deferred for something like 10 years. Over that time, you can't just walk away from either nuclear facilities or oil and gas facilities, leave them for 10 years and come back and expect to be able to just access them. They have to be maintained. There is a cost for that ongoing maintenance. And the cost is not just the physical cost of maintaining, but it's all the management costs that go with it. So if you look at that ongoing cost against the uncertainty of what the decommissioning cost will be at the end, we're in a buyer's market at the moment, but that will change, and commodity prices are going to become tighter. So deferring has that year-on-year cost, and there's that uncertainty against what the final liability is going to be.
Thank you, Andrew. That's all the questions we've time for. Thank you to everyone for taking part. Our next next decommissioning event, is on collaborative approaches to decommissioning. It takes place this coming Tuesday morning, 4th of July at Haydock Racecourse. Details are on the screen now. If you'd like to attend, please do email or call my colleague April. Her details are shown on the screen. Our next webinar will be towards the end of July and will cover offshore decommissioning of wind turbines and the international opportunities to decommission mining sector tailings. If you're not familiar with tailings, I think anyone who's involved in managing complex waste materials will find that particularly interesting. You can find full details of all our upcoming events and webinars on www.decomhub.com, and details of how to become a subscriber to the hub to gain reduced price access to events, free access to previous event presentations, webinar recordings, and much more. So thank you once again to Andrew, and I look forward to seeing some of you next week at the racecourse. Thank you all.
Thank you.